Hello everyone, welcome to week 8. I want to use this video today to talk a little bit about the expectations for this week. First, I want to mention exam 1, which is now available on Carmen. This will be worth 10% of your grade, and you'll be able to take this exam online from the Class Carmen website in the quizzes section all throughout this week, so from Monday through Sunday at 11:59 p.m. That would be March 3rd. The exam will only be available during this week, but you can take it whenever you would like during the week. You may want to consider taking it during the office hours of the teaching staff, so if you run into any problems or have questions, you can get quick feedback from us via chat on the Carmen chat or Google chat or email. If you take it during any other times, you'll just be kind of open to whatever our availability might be. We might not be able to respond to your message in time for it to be useful for you taking the exam. The exam will have a time limit of 1 hour, and during that time you can access your notes, the textbook, the internet, whatever resources might be helpful for you. The exam will consist of multiple choice, matching, and long answer questions. One thing I want to mention is that there's a lot of stuff to get through in that 1 hour for the exam. So you want to be sure that you're familiar with all your material, that it's well organized, because you probably won't have time to look up every answer to every question, even though you have access to those open materials. So be sure to budget your time, know the material, so you're able to take this exam well. Just for your information, the first time I used this online test in my traditional classroom, students got lower grades overall because they saw it was going to be open note, open book, and online, and they thought that they wouldn't have to study for it because they'd have access to everything. But it was really a challenge to organize that information and get to it in a quick and correct manner. So the exam is going to cover everything that we've learned in the course from the beginning through last week, so Module 7 on the Middle East and North Africa. There is a study guide available on Carmen that provides major points to focus on. The questions can be drawn from anywhere in the course materials, so lecture videos, readings, activities, things like that. I would suggest you use the study guide in conjunction with some of the main points revisited at the end of the chapters in your textbook. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask. I, Jessica, am going to be the main person that's grading the exam, but Chris and Shining will also be able to help you with some of your questions. Sorry about that. So now I want to proceed into talking about Module 8 on Russia and Central Asia. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Soviet Empire and the different uses of space in that, and legacies that continue of Soviet rule and development as it stands today. So I want to start by looking at your impressions of this part of the world. As you can see, climate favors largely. You have the notion of cold weather here, also the Cold War, so the historic relationship with the United States, and thinking about legacies of communism as well. We also see some cultural things such as vodka. You have the idea of it being different and vast, things like that. So we'll talk about some of these things, and you'll read about some of them in your textbook. Now, your textbook gives an extensive history of this area before the Soviet Union was formed and some of the history of that formation. What I want to do is to look a little bit at the main ideas behind it and what it's meant in terms of uses of space. So I want to define state socialism. This is a form of based on principles of collective ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods dominated and directed by state bureaucracies. And we talked about capitalism as a form of economy, but also as a form of social organization. We can think of that as being the case for state socialism as well. So economic organization and social organization are very much tied together. These are based on, again, that principle of collectivism, so people having sort of group ownership and control of different facets of society, and then also the administration of everything within society is then, in theory, by the people, and the state then were the representatives of the people. But how it played out was more of an authoritarian state where people did not have a lot of choice, democratic style representation, and it became a more authoritarian system. How this played out was then command economies, where the national economies and all aspects of production and distribution are centrally controlled by government agencies. This is different from in places like the United States and Europe, where the government does control, some aspects of the economy, but this was extensive control over all aspects of production and distribution. One of the big things that affected how the Soviet Union moved forward was World War II. So the Soviet Union suffered tremendous losses, 25 million people killed in that conflict. So just huge numbers of folks. 1,700 towns and cities destroyed, 84,000 villages lost, and 60% of the industrial facilities destroyed as they fought the Germans along that Eastern Front. So after World War II, the Soviets were really concerned about trying to avoid having that sort of destruction be repeated. So that's one of the reasons for the Soviets to kind of create a buffer zone within Europe. And we talked about this, and you read about this a little bit when we talked about Europe. So this notion of creating a protective zone where you have these Eastern European countries that are allied with the Soviet Union, and then also this idea of an Iron Curtain that separates Eastern Europe with Soviet influence and Western Europe. So as the Bolsheviks came into power and began sort of planning the government economies, their big push was to try to industrialize the economy. It was largely agrarian, or most folks working and living in rural areas on farms. So within this planning, they came up with this idea of territorial production complexes. So this is the notion of trying to produce a particular manufactured good in a particular place. So choosing an area and planning to put all the manufacturing there for that particular thing. This was, planned across the Soviet Union as a whole, that was made up of various different republics. The notion was that these republics would all have different things that they would produce, and then they would be economically interdependent. So because the republics could all, work together, trade goods together, you have this interdependence of the republics. The major goal of the Soviet Union was to try to speed industrialization, and they did this quite well. They had a 10% growth rate in the 1950s. So this map shows you examples of some of the major manufacturing regions. You can see around the area of Moscow in the Western Soviet Union. Another place that's prominent is around the Ural Mountains, which you heard about recently with the meteor that fell there, and then various places through more central parts of the Soviet era. You can see then two railroads connecting the entire empire. Most of this focused in the southern part where the climate was less extreme. For the rural economy in the Soviet Union, the focus was on trying to collectivize agriculture. So instead of having individual farmers working pieces of land that they owned, they moved peasants to state-owned collective farms. Now, people who disagreed with this policy, or the dissidents, were sent to forced labor or imprisoned or killed. With this drive to industrialize, there was a lot of infrastructure projects that were planned and put forward that made efforts to try to transform nature based on trying to maximize production. And so there's been major environmental degradations because the environment and sustainability were often not taken into account. What we see on this map is some of the environmental issues as a result of some of this industrialization. So there was not a lot of effort to try to control pollution. So you see throughout the region places in the red that have catastrophic or irreparable damage, and then places in the purple are places with crisis proportions. There are also sites shown that have been heavily contaminated, so places where you see the stars. You have nuclear waste, nuclear accident sites, things like that. So a lot of real major environmental problems. Also, a lot of resource use, like deforestation, use of pesticides, soil erosion, air and water pollution, and diversions of rivers. So major planning projects. One of the more famous environmental disasters in the area is the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown that happened in 1986. So a nuclear reactor had melted down in the area that was now Belarus. Huge amounts of devastation, 3,000 square miles of trees killed, 25% of Belarus uninhabitable, and 1,000 villages abandoned. Now this was more of a less obvious sort of disaster because there wasn't sort of a large explosion, things like that, but radiation is kind of a silent killer that makes people sick over time and has had lasting effects in the air. You can see on this map radiation hotspots resulting from Chernobyl accident. So in places red, you have a closed zone that is still not really accessible to people. There's also sort of larger areas of permanent control that you see on here as well. Much of this area has been turned into things like a wildlife refuge. There's actually folks that have begun to move back to areas around the plant that are elderly folks because it's a very cheap place to live and they have short life expectancy anyway, so the long-term effects of radiation don't so much matter to them because they're not expected to live that long. There's a link on the class content page where a photographer visits some of these sites and tells a little bit more of the story. You can check that out on your own. What socialist urban planning meant for urban form in the Soviet Union was this idea of an egalitarian philosophy underlying everything. So the notion that everybody should have access to housing, that housing would be provided by the state. What it played out as rather drab, similar landscapes throughout many cities within the Soviet Union. The idea was housing for all, but it was often very crowded, very difficult to get the better houses, and the folks that did find better access were those who had powerful political ties within different parties. There is a link on the Carmen page to a website that explores some of these things and has some testimonials from folks about what it was like to live in some of these apartments where you might have a relatively small apartment with entire families or numbers of families living in and sharing the space.